Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, and rideshare drivers in general are quitting more than ever before. And I have reviewed hundreds of comments on this channel. I've interviewed over 100 drivers talking about the pros and the cons. So in this video, I'm gonna talk about the 5 biggest reasons why drivers are quitting extremely fast. Number 1, money. As you can imagine, this is the biggest thing. Drivers are not being paid what they should be being paid. Now, I have talked about this in other videos. It's very interesting. 25% of drivers are actually, which may blow a lot of drivers' minds, 25% of drivers are making more money than ever before. However, 75% of drivers, or most drivers, are making way less than ever before. And what's very unfortunate, so I first started driving, it's tough for me, maybe I have to check my first ever ride to get the exact timestamp, but I believe it was at the end of 2014. When I first started driving, Lyft and Uber was so new, and a lot of my friends said, hey, what's the average amount you make hourly? And I said, to be honest, about $20 to $25 an hour on average. Now it's crazy. 10 years later, almost a decade later now, making this video, if someone were to ask me, what is the average amount an Uber and Lyft driver makes, I'd say about $20 to $25 an hour. So in 10 years, in almost a decade, the amount that you make as a driver, not that much more. And as we all know, the economy, inflation, things are getting more expensive, et cetera, et cetera. It is unfortunate that drivers are making way less than ever before. Another huge aspect to this, which I don't know what's going on. I'm going to be very blunt. I read tons of articles. I read tons of statistics, math. I do a lot of interviews with drivers. I don't know what's going on when it comes to this, and that is Uber and Lyft's cut. When I first started driving, it was a hard 20%. If I made $100, I'd take 80. Uber or Lyft would take 20. The math was very, very simple. It was 20%. Now though, Uber and Lyft is taking more than ever before. So what's kind of unfortunate is, yeah, I might say, oh, Uber and Lyft drivers make $20 to $25 an hour, but there's a glaring asterisk on that because there's a lot of other expenses, maintenance, taxes, blah, 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 which I'll talk about a little bit later in this video. But the biggest one is that now Uber and Lyft, I've heard of some drivers, and this is where it gets weird. I've heard of some drivers saying, hey, Mark, yeah, Uber and Lyft now takes 50% of earnings. And I'm like, well, that's weird. Then I talk to another driver who says, no, he goes, in my area, they take 30%, or they take 40%. So what's weird is it appears that Uber and Lyft is now adjusting how much money they take out of the driver's earnings. And to me, it seems random. I don't know if it's a location-based thing, because remember, your location has huge implications of how much money you can make as a driver. But it's weird that I get so many comments of people saying and giving me different percentages of how much money Uber and Lyft is taking out in terms of their cut. Doesn't really make any sense. It seems like that before, I remember, it was a hard 20%. That was it. There was no games, no questions. But like I said, I've heard of some drivers telling me that it fluctuates. Some weeks they take out 25%. Sometimes it adjusts over time. I've heard of maybe it's dependent upon your location. Maybe in Phoenix, Arizona, they take 25%, but in Seattle, Washington, they take 30%. And then maybe in Boston, which is where I used to drive, maybe now they take out 40%. I honestly don't know. That's one huge thing for a whole other video. But at the end of the day, when you look at the math, the accounting, the statistics, drivers are making way less than ever before. And it's making them say, why would I continue driving? I might as well just get another job. Number 2, unfair treatment. It's probably no surprise to anybody. I mean, this is kind of the corporate world, or the just job industry or career industry or whatever. Uber and Lyft favors their passengers way more than their drivers. And this is something that's probably not too surprising, right? But as a driver, it starts to get extremely unfair, as if there's any weird altercation or incident or situation, for some reason, no matter what, it is almost always going to be your fault. This is where I do suggest for a couple different pro tips for drivers. 1, get a dash cam. You have footage both of the outside of your vehicle and the inside. A lot of dash cams now for rideshare drivers are 2 ways. I also have a link listed below in the description to some site if you want to check out dash cams. You can even get 2, but there are some that are like a 2-in-1. That way, if you have like a weird incident inside of the vehicle, you have proof, and also the outside of the vehicle. The second thing for all the drivers out there if you do have any minor, even minor incident or dispute with a passenger, contact Uber and Lyft right away saying, hey, just want to let you know, I just had this ride, this happened, I just want to let you know. There is something about the first contact, as I like to call it, that at least you're preparing them, as opposed to them saying, hey, we just got this weird message from one of your passengers that said that you did this and this. Explain yourself, and now you're on like the defensive end. And it's unfortunate that you have to do this now as drivers. It is very, very common for passengers to complain, like say, especially if alcohol is involved, and somehow it's always your fault. And Uber and Lyft will almost always treat you unfairly compared to the passenger. The big thing especially is deactivation. In case you don't know, what this typically means is they don't allow you to drive whatsoever. Now, granted, usually it is fairly quick for them to reactivate you. So I've heard of some drivers being deactivated for 2 or 3 days, some of them up to a week or even 2 weeks. And what's unfortunate is you miss out on the money. Like say you're driving, you're putting food on the table, you're making ends meet, you're paying off bills, you rely on Uber and Lyft as that income. Like say a passenger complains about something that's BS. It's just a completely stupid claim because they were in a bad mood or whatever. And let's say Uber and Lyft says, you know what, we're gonna investigate this. Because of course, there are some bad drivers out there. Of course there are. So Uber and Lyft will say, oh, you know what, we're gonna investigate this. They deactivate your account. A week goes by, you're like, great, I just missed out on a week's worth of work. And then Uber or Lyft contacts you again saying, hey, we reactivated your account. After investigating this, we realized they were wrong and you were right. We're sorry about that. And you're like, okay, that's great, I can drive again. But you just deactivated me for an entire week that I was not able to work, right? And this is something as well, I know a lot of drivers have told me that once that happens to you, even just once, there's this weird anxiety in the back of your head saying, when is it gonna happen again where I turn on the app and for whatever reason, Uber or Lyft says, hey, your account's been deactivated. We'll let you know when it's reactivated. It might be in a day or a week or whatever. And as you can imagine, for a lot of drivers, you don't really have a lot of protection, especially because most drivers are independent contractors. You don't have a lot of protection. And so Uber and Lyft can treat you as unfairly as they want. And as it's been getting worse, as they've been treating their drivers worse, a lot of drivers are saying, you know what? I'm done. Number 3, legal issues. This is something that over time has been getting way worse because back in the day, you really didn't have to worry about, in terms of being a driver, all these weird legal things coming up. It was kind of a gray area where I think a lot of people, like insurance companies and the like, didn't know where to put it in terms of a category. Now, though, you almost have to have rideshare insurance, right? There's been a lot of situations where drivers get, like, say, into accidents, and Uber and Lyft, although they should cover you, won't. And a lot of drivers are saying, great, if something happens to me on the road, even if it's not my fault, Uber and Lyft is still not going to cover me when they should be covering me. This doesn't make any sense. In addition, signing up to be a rideshare driver for some cities is pretty easy. Boston is a good example. You pretty much just sign up and that's it. Other cities, though, I just did a video about Portland, Oregon, in terms of their requirements. You have to register yourself as a business, as a rideshare driver. You have to get a special license, not special license, but special certificate, all these different things just to drive. And there's all these weird legal elements constantly coming into play. It's a huge issue now. You know, there was a huge thing in Minnesota where they wanted to pass a bill basically saying, hey, we want to protect drivers, get a minimum hourly guarantee, and Minnesota denied it, right? There's all these things coming up when it comes to the legal aspects of being a rideshare driver that are constantly making it worse. Now, yes, there are some improvements, right? I mean, here in California, after Prop 22, drivers now have a minimum hourly guarantee. There's different things with health insurance. So there are some situations in terms of the legal stuff of being a rideshare driver that have gotten better, right? But even so, when you're talking about all the weird things with insurance, with Uber and Lyft being a lot worse when it comes to insurance, all the legal stuff you have to do as a rideshare driver, and there's all these different things you have to worry about. A lot of drivers are saying, look, if something negative happens to me when I'm driving, I'm pretty much on my own, and especially I'm not making that much money, and with everything coming into play, and all this unfair treatment, why would I drive when I'm putting myself even more at risk to be in a financial situation or financial hole? Rideshare driving is just not worth it. Number 4, maintenance. This one is beginning significantly worse, especially involving the money aspect. Now, like I said, in 2014, let's say / beginning of 2015, when someone asked me, what does the average driver make? I say $20 to $25 an hour on average. Now, it's the same exact amount 10 years later. But as we know, in the past 10 years, things have gotten more expensive. And as a driver, especially if you look at the classic example of gas is way more expensive, especially here in LA. A lot of other big cities, gas is extremely expensive. So you're spending more and more on gas. You're probably spending more on oil changes. You're spending more on all these different things for your vehicle. And yet the amount that now you're making is less and less and less. Gas is definitely the biggest thing. So especially when it comes to all the money aspects, that you're like, great, I'm making way less money than ever before, but now I'm spending more money than ever before just on my vehicle. A lot of drivers are saying, wow, now I really walk away with just a small amount of money. It's completely not worth it whatsoever. In addition, and I guess it does make some logical sense, but Uber and Lyft now requires you to get your car inspected. I just did an inspection for my vehicle. I did it through Yoshi, which is kind of like a mobile inspection service. It was $30. Not the worst thing in the world, but now it's like, okay, every year you have to spend $20 or $30 to get your car inspected to drive, right? All the money you're spending in gas is shrinking your earnings. It's just with all the maintenance and the costs of being a driver, that's in addition to just everything else, like all the costs of being a driver are significantly going up while your earnings are continuing to go down. And a lot of drivers are saying, when you do all the math out, I'm just making almost nothing. Number 5, the disrespect. This is one that I find over time really drives a lot of drivers, I guess pun intended, or intentional pun. It drives a lot of drivers to say, you know what, I'm done. And this is what I found when I used to be an accountant, for example, that, and this is not always true, but I find a good amount of the time, it's never the, like say, big things of a job or the big negative things of a job that make you quit. It's all the little things that at first you're like, okay, that's kind of annoying, but whatever. But then those little things start to add up over and over and day by day. You're like, okay, you know what? I am just absolutely done. Especially when it comes to driving, it becomes frustrating. Then, like say, when you get back to your place, you look back in your car and there's a bunch of empty trash. Your car's a mess. You have to clean your car almost every single day. And of course, nothing bad with having a clean car, but every single day when you're like, all right, great. Someone left a bunch of napkins. Someone left a bunch of paper towels in the back. Someone left their McDonald's bag in the back. There's been so many times, like say when I used to drive, and this was super scary, where I look in the back, go to clean it out, as I have to do every single time, and there was a bunch of empty beer cans that someone hid, and somehow I missed it when driving because I was focusing on driving, trying to be a good driver. And imagine if, like say, I got pulled over, because especially in Massachusetts, you're not allowed to have open containers. What do I do if a cop pulls me over, God forbid, and they say, hey, we see these 5 empty beer cans or whatever? That is super annoying, right? Dealing with a lot of passengers as well. I will say most passengers are pretty cool. I'd say 90% are like pretty cool, but then you get some passengers where you're like, what am I doing here type thing. It becomes very, very annoying, where then you worry, am I gonna get these passengers a lot? Especially because the biggest time to drive is Friday and Saturday nights. You then realize, wow, most of the passengers I'm gonna get are probably gonna be inebriated or drunk. That is something you do have to deal with. Another thing is tipping. It's still very weird the way tipping culture works. I will say, I feel like I'm in the old school ride-sharing world versus the new school. Back in the day, no one tipped for Uber and Lyft, by the way. In case you didn't know, no one tipped for Uber and Lyft. So for me, I'm actually not used to ever getting tips. It was very weird. Uber and Lyft was very strict that you should deny any tip. I think it was like a 3-stage process. If someone goes to tip you, you say no tips. If someone goes to tip you again, you say, no, sorry, no tips. If they ask a third time, then you say, okay, you know what? Typically you don't tip, but I appreciate the tip and you accept it. Because at that point, then you're just being rude, right? So it's weird that Uber and Lyft is very strict about this. And the main reason why, which could be a whole other subject for a whole other video, is they wanted the experience to be a cashless transaction. That was actually the biggest reason for tipping, not to make things cheaper, but because they said, look, when it comes to a taxi or buying a coffee, there's this weird thing where you give someone money, you get change back, or you put your card in the machine and then you wait a little bit and all that kind of stuff. When it comes to ride sharing though, they said, look, we want that whole money transaction or transfer to be behind the scenes. We almost want to act like it doesn't exist. That's their big reason why they didn't allow tips. And I think as a result of that, it's gotten more and more common over time. And I think this is changing, I will say, which is good, that people still sometimes not used to tipping. For me, I'm not used to someone tipping. And it's funny that for me, if I were to do a ride, and someone were to tip me, I'd be like, oh my God, I got a tip. That's huge. I'd be flabbergasted. And ironically, for let's say a newer driver, let's say someone who just started driving, if they didn't get a tip, they'd probably be just as flabbergasted as me saying, oh, wow, I didn't get a tip. That's weird, right? And of course, when it comes to ride sharing, this is very unfortunate with not getting tips. With a bartender, there is, let's say you go to a bar, you order a drink, there is some like low-key social pressure where you, of course, will always tip your bartenders, always tip your servers, because if you don't, it's gonna be weird. Like say you get that bill, you write 0, you cross it out, and you give it back to them, they're right there. When it comes to delivery drivers, you always tip even before the food gets there. When it comes to delivery driving though, you can leave the vehicle, not tip, and what is the driver gonna do? Then they can't, I mean, not saying a bartender is gonna confront you, although they might, or a waiter might, or a waitress might, but when it comes to rideshare driver, it's almost this removal of that social pressure where you can leave the vehicle, not tip at all, no sweat to you, and the driver's just like, great, I just did this huge ride and I did not get a tip. So not getting tip really starts to add up. Your car being messy, and you're trying to clean it, and people being super loud and obnoxious on those nights. In addition, like say Uber and Lyft will pair you with a ride that you drive 15 minutes to pick somebody up and they're going 2 minutes down the road. Now, of course, that person did nothing wrong, but it's kind of annoying that you're like, great, I just drove 15 minutes to bring this person 2 minutes down the road, WTF, right? And then in addition, on top of that, there's been some times where someone ordered a ride, I drive 5 minutes to pick them up. I get there and I'm like, hey, I'm outside, and they're like, wait, you already got here? And I'm like, yeah, I drove here. I'm ready to pick you up. I'm right outside. And they're like, oh, sorry, we're not ready yet. We'll just cancel and order another one. They'll cancel the ride. And I'm like, great, I just drove 5 minutes or 10 minutes to pick somebody up. They're not ready yet, which is a pro tip for anybody watching who does order Ubers and Lyfts. Only order when you're actually ready to be picked up, right? Just want to say that. But I drive all the way there. I'm there too early for the person. They cancel. And yeah, I do get a cancellation fee of like, I don't know, $5. But then it's like, great, I just drove all the way there to have the person cancel on me. And now I'm only getting paid $5 for this ride when I just wasted all this gas and time and blah, blah, blah. And then when you add all these things that feel almost like a bit of disrespect to you as a driver, driving around, trying to bring people from point A to point B. If there's traffic, it's your fault. If, like, say, something happens, it's your fault. People, like, say, want to stop at 7-Eleven and they go in for 5 or 10 or 15 minutes. You're sitting outside waiting. If, like, say, you're driving on a Friday and Saturday night and it's 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. and people want to go through the McDonald's drive-thru and there's a huge line, it's like, well, it's tricky because if you say no, you're a jerk and you're definitely not getting tipped. You might get a bad rating, even if you're a good driver. But if you say yes, now you're waiting in line in this McDonald's line, really not making any money, because remember, for drivers, you make the least amount of money when being idle, right? The miles is what really adds it up, and then when you add all this into play with getting less bonuses, less surges, you're not getting paid that much money, you're dealing with all this insurance stuff and the legal aspects, you're being treated unfairly when it comes to Uber and Lyft in terms of being deactivated or them always taking the passenger side, you're spending more money for maintenance. All these things start to really set up, really just add up in general, where for a lot of drivers, they're like, you know what? I'm done.